on, fellows that follow the sea, to me way below the man down. Put a vent on your ears and listen to me. Give me some time to blow the man down. Where boys become greenhorns and greens become mates, to me way below the man down. And if you ain't into fishing, you're in the wrong place. Give me some time to blow the man down. To me way.
My name is Chuck Viet, and I'm president of the Navy Marine Living History Association. And the presentation you're about to see today is on African Americans in the United States Navy during the Civil War. Most of what folks today understand about the black contribution to putting down the rebellion is couched in terms of the Army. There were almost 180,000 black troops in the war, and most people are familiar with this from the movie Glory, which I was shocked to realize came out 30 years ago almost now. I keep on saying the recent movie. This was a reasonably accurate portrayal, but there were a lot of limitations if you served as a black infantryman. For instance, they were separated from white troops, but definitely treated totally unequally. For instance, their pay was often delayed. When the pay did arrive, it was less than what white soldiers got. And what's more, they used to deduct money from that for a clothing allotment, which wasn't levied against white soldiers. They were given inferior medical care. They were given inferior equipment. Their weapons were always secondhand or second best. And they'd worked in segregated units initially under all white officers. So yeah, they were allowed to fight, but it wasn't exactly equal. Most folks assume that this experience was just duplicated in the U.S. Navy. That really couldn't be further from the truth. Before we talk about what Secretary Wells, who was a staunch abolitionist, did to ensure equality, we need to go back quite a ways to the founding of the country and see how black sailors were treated from the get-go. In the Continental Navy, there were thousands and thousands of black sailors. State navies, every state along the coast had its own navy at that time, and the percentage was even higher in those particular navies. The guys were treated equally, the same as the white sailors. On some ships, they were the majority crew. However, at the end of the war, the Revolutionary War, we didn't have the money to finance a navy. So it was pretty much disbanded, and we didn't re-found the navy really until about 1798. We had a quasi-war with France, which saw us build 6 frigates, which is the beginning of the U.S. Navy. And unfortunately, as soon as they were built and the war ended, there was an economic boom because the French and British were fighting the Napoleonic Wars. There's no one to transship goods around the planet. So white sailors flee to better paying, less harsh jobs in the merchant marine. What that means is that there are a higher number of blacks in the U.S. Navy at that time. By the time we go to war with England in 1812, 10% of the fleet is African American. By the time that begins, for instance, in 1813, the Battle of Lake Erie, fully half of Perry's crew, this is Perry as in don't give up the ship, they are African American. And there are 360 black Marines scattered across his flotilla. There are some glimmers of equality here in these quotes from various captains and commodores. For instance, Isaac Chauncey said basically, I have never seen that the cut of the clothes or the color of the skin has the least thing to do with qualifying you as a sailor. In defending Washington, this commodore here, Barney, was asked by President Madison, who was a Southerner, won't your black sailors run as soon as the British show up? I said, no, they'll die at their guns first. They don't know how to run. In another episode, there were 2 black sailors that basically played a pivotal role in repelling a British privateer. And in the report, their captain said, with tars or sailors like these, we have nothing to fear from tyrants of the ocean. So black sailors were very numerous in the fleet and very much respected. This is Usher Parsons was the only surgeon at that Battle of Lake Erie. And he has a unique claim here. I can't quite buy all of it. But he believed that there was an absence of prejudice across the fleet. It may have been his ship. He says that other crews acted the same way. There didn't really seem to be the rampant racism that would grow in later years. Starting really with the end of the war. At the end of the war, blacks were barred from the military. They were thrown out of the Army despite the contributions they had made. The Navy is also illegal, but the Navy is so desperate for men that Washington just sort of turned another eye. If you'd thrown everyone who wasn't lily white out of the fleet, there would have been no fleet. In 1822, it gets worse in the South. They are fearful that when federal ships pull into port like Charleston or Wilmington, that the crews go on liberty and the blacks will somehow influence local blacks to rebel. So whenever you go ashore on liberty as a black sailor on a federal warship in the South, you get to spend all that time in jail. What's more, your captain is expected to pay for your room and board, shall we say. So this really rankled, as it should. In 1837, again, there's another economic panic, depression, and guys are fleeing, or trying to find any job they can. This includes the Navy, even though it's a rough job. And so the quota for blacks is set at 5%, which is pretty low. Now, why is the Navy only resorted to whenever times are bad? Some of these books here we think of as great literature and subject our kids to them. Melville and Charles Dana wrote basically exposés that told American citizens who had no experience at the fleet just how bad conditions were. Life in the Navy was considered to be as close as a white man could come to experiencing slavery. Your captain could have you executed by flogging. It's the only place a white man could be flogged. Discipline was incredibly harsh, and the captain's word was God. So nobody really wanted to join the Navy. But for free blacks, especially in the North, despite the harsh discipline, it represents an opportunity to have a steady job, a stable life. Granted, you might be at sea for months on end, but when you got home, your wife and kids could still be there knowing you were going to bring them support in the form of a paycheck. In 1850, the Navy passed a major milestone. It actually abolished flogging. Those two expose books were pivotal in doing this. The public was shocked at how harsh Navy discipline was. And they basically instituted a system of rewarding for good behavior rather than punishing for bad behavior. The South was frankly freaked out by this because the Navy had been the big people advocating whipping fellow human beings, along with Southern plantation owners. Now the South, with the exception of the U.S. Army, is left in the embarrassing position of being the only group of people who are still saying it's okay to whip people. The war begins, the fleet is down to 2.5% African-American sailors, which is half the 5% quota, which means there's room for expansion. And this was absolutely necessary because all of a sudden we have plenty of gunboats coming off the assembly lines or shipyards and no one to crew them. Gideon Wells needs crews in a big hurry. Only Army enlistments at this time count towards state bounties. For instance, Massachusetts would say the federal government wants 50,000 men. If 40,000 join the Army and 10,000 join the Navy, we only sent 40,000 men as far as Washington is concerned. The Navy doesn't count. There are no bounties for sailors either. If you join the fleet, you don't get that 1 year's pay or the government $100 bounty. There's no monetary impetus for joining the fleet. But because blacks are barred from serving in the Army, but want to serve to help fight, they're a great pool of recruits for the U.S. Navy. Wells immediately enlists 900 free African Americans. He's got his men for the fleet. This is noticed by the black community in the North. The Liberators, the paper, was based in Boston. It is an abolitionist paper. And 21st of February, this is a great quote to remember. Basically, the Navy has not been in the habit of examining the color of a man's skin. Can you fight is the only question. That's the bottom line, and that's what the Navy is asking. Wells can get away with this. Why? When the Army's barred from enlisting black men, pretty much it comes down to how the two different groups recruited. If you're an infantry regiment here from Lynn or from Armet in North Attleboro, anywhere, you do your drill pretty much on the town green or a camp that's not far from the city. People come out and they like to watch you drill. They obviously will notice if all you guys who are drilling aren't white. Navy doesn't do it that way. For one thing, the recruiter doesn't come to you and say, all you guys follow me. Recruits come to what's called a rendezvous, literally get together. And you sign up, you're inspected by a doctor, and you're sent off what's called a receiving ship, which is this smaller picture here. This one still has its masts, often those were removed. It's boarded over, roofed over. And there, they test what skills you have, teach you some new skills, and what's more, when you are assigned to a ship out in the squadron, you don't go by 30s and 40s. An officer will come and say, I need 6 guys who's skilled at this, that, or the other thing, and pick you, and you. So off you go. No one gets a parade down Main Street. No one sees that the Navy is of mixed ethnicity. This works really well for the Navy and for blacks. Lincoln turns a blind eye. His famous quote is, when this is pointed out to him, the Navy must have its men. There was no argument against that. There are 2 different kinds of recruits that enter the Navy. In the North, a lot of the black community was skilled either in previous Navy assignments or the merchant marine or especially the whaling fleets. So these guys come in and 63% of them are enlisted as landsmen or as ordinary seamen or even higher, maybe petty officers. Their rank is based on their ability, which they can demonstrate. The second group is encountered mostly in the South. Again, to use Butler's word, contraband, which means something that's valuable in war that the South not allowed to have, which included slaves. Wells told them, you have to enlist them at the lowest rank. He's an abolitionist, but he's sensitive to the fact that if suddenly you start bringing in Southern blacks at ranks higher than white sailors, there might be some rumbling in the North. So he's sensitive to the politics. However, he's sensitive only to the letter of the law. The spirit of the law, he doesn't really follow too much. He instructs his officers that it's the spirit of the law that will apply. All the blacks in the South are enlisted as boy, and this is not a racial slur, it's a legitimate Navy rank. It's the lowest rank you can have, and there are plenty of white boys on board the ships. They're enlisted as boys on muster sheets, but then when the captains talk to them and realize they have skills, they're bumped up several notches to what are called landsmen. A lot of white guys are enlisted as landsmen too. It's sort of a slighting term, meaning you know nothing about the sea, do you? But 68% of them qualified at least as landsmen. Ships' captains at remote stations, and bear in mind, there's no telegraph at sea, there's nothing, there's no couriers. They can get away with whatever they want pretty much. And Wells sort of tells them, you promote as you see fit, and I know nothing. It's sort of like the Sergeant Schultz approach from Hogan's Heroes. A surprise for the Navy was the large number of fleeing freed slaves who come to the ships. They hadn't really anticipated this. Some ships will come back from a riverine cruise with 700 to 1,000 escaped slaves. So what do you do with all these freedmen? They weren't expecting that. The Army, of course, put everybody in a train and took them north. This was efficient but cruel because you have now 1,000 people, let's use that as a round number, who are used to southern temperatures, which means reasonably mild winters and warm summers. And the Army would set up, I would call them concentration camps, they would bridle at that, but they'd bring them up to the north. Now you expect them to winter over in Ohio or Pennsylvania or New York State, and it's bitter cold conditions as far as they're concerned. The Navy can't do this. For one, they don't want to use their gunboats as taxis or cargo ships. They can't take them offline. What the Navy does is set up a series of small camps along the coast in the area where these folks escaped to. And the camps are not just for escaped freedmen, they're also for white unionists. In those camps, they allow them to take over the plantations, grow food for their own subsistence. They also arm them. This was kept very, very quiet because, my God, to arm a black man in 1862, people up north would have flipped out. Lincoln just says, do it and don't tell me about it. There's also a gunboat stationed at each one of these, and the camp is under supervision of a Navy officer. A couple times the rebels would, come close and make trouble, but with the gunboat there and the fact that it's only, 1,000, maybe 2,000 slaves, it wasn't worth the effort, especially when they'd all been trained how to fire a musket. This is a day that really should be in the history books, the 25th of March, 1862. You've all heard of the Monitor and Merrimack battle. Well, when Merrimack fought to a standstill with Monitor, of course, it was the day after. She had sunk one and set afire two of our major ships of the line. And to remedy this, Gideon Welles tells Lincoln, don't worry, we're working on an ironclad, and we think it can take it out. Secretary of War Stanton hears this discussion and says, well, how many guns does she have? Knowing that Virginia has about 4 or 5 on her broadside. And he says, oh, 2. And Welles pretty much flips out. Eyewitness reports say that he ran up and down the halls of the White House, flinging his arms in the air, sitting down writing some manic order, came back, asked more questions that didn't make him happy, and ran off again. And Welles decides that the guy is going around the bend. What Stanton does, though, is, okay, if the Navy can't handle this with their 2 pop-gun, tin-clad ship, I will take care of it. He goes to New York and contracts with a trio, eventually 9, iron-hulled civilian ships. Now, these guys are crewed by civilians, under civilian officers, and they sign on for extra hazardous duty. This usually means running up a river under rebel guns, delivering supplies, something like that. The ships need coal further upstream, and the men are used to that. There are actually some cannon on board these ships. The guys are drilled and cutlass drilled, no big deal. They get down to Hampton Roads, and the local flag officer tells them, Flag Officer Goldsborough, thanks them very much. Tells them they're very brave sons of the Republic, and now we can finally sink the Merrimack. And I'll paraphrase. Almost every man said, what? You're kidding me. Everyone, they're civilians, so they don't desert. Let's just say they de-volunteer. So most of the ships are now out of crews. And the crews go back to New York where they're trying to recruit new crews. Come to find out that Stanton and Welles had never thought it important to tell anybody what their mission was going to be. So these guys get gobsmacked by the news that you're going off the most feared ship of the world when they're right down there across the river from where it is stationed. And so you understand why when the first crews talk to engineers on the second crew, suddenly there's no second crew for some of these ships. Eventually they do all find crews, and the Navy says, well, okay, you got one ship here, the Arago, which is going to lose its contract, and we'll send it back unless you can scrounge up a crew. And they're willing to enlist them. They said, all we need are strong backs because we'll put Navy officers on board. And so the captain, whose name I believe is Gadsden, goes to Fortress Monroe and asks General Wool, can I have 50 guys, 50 white soldiers? And Wolf says, I need 10,000 men. You can't have anybody. But there is a pool of men, if you're willing to try it, because this has never been tried in this war yet, you can try and get 50 guys. And his quartermaster, a guy by the name of LeGrand Cannon, I checked him in the census, his name really is the big gun. But LeGrand Cannon takes about 350 stevedores who've been working for the Army and the Navy, unloading and reloading and shipping supplies off Fortress Monroe. And he assembles them on the parade ground. And he gives them, it was a stirring speech, but mostly it laid it on the line. He said, you saw what happened the other day with those 2 ships. We're assembling some ram ships to go after them, and one of the cowardly white crews from one of these ships won't fight. They turned their man. And here is your chance to prove that it is worthwhile fighting to free you. And he tells them, some of you will die and be martyrs. Some of you will be wounded. But no race has ever freed itself without shedding blood. And in what I would otherwise think was a bad scene from a bad Hollywood movie, when he asked for volunteers, all 350 men stepped forward, just stomped the ground. He took the 50 biggest guys, because again, they're shoveling coal, they're raising the anchor, they're not expected to know anything about the Navy, but they all enlisted. And the fact that we never had to use the ram ships doesn't take away from the fact that they enlisted knowing we might have to. And even though at his court-martial, the Confederate commander said, oh, I knew about the ram ships, they weren't worried. Well, he also never came out to face them. And they probably would have worked, because that Virginia or Merrimack takes a very long time to turn. We're talking a half-hour turnaround. If you have 4 ram ships coming in 4 directions, his broadsides might savage 2 of them. 2 more are going to get through. And remember, his deck is this far above the water. If you ride up over that, you can sink it. So you could be looking at some of the crewmen who might well have sunk Virginia had she had the nerve to come face the ram fleet. These guys stayed in the Navy. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Fox went down several times to check on them, because we had had integrated crews. Fox was aware of this. He was an ex-Navy man. We had never before had an all-black crew in such a critical position. So this was the first time, and it's just, I ran across this in LeGrand Cannon's personal diary, basically, and no one else seems to know about it. But it was a signal day in the history of African Americans in the Civil War. So remember what Usher Parsons had said about the War of 1812. How were the descendants of those black sailors treated? Now bear in mind, throughout this, it is easy to find instances of individual racism. It's the 1860s, I'm not apologizing, but you go looking for it, it's all too easy to find. But institutionally, how were African Americans treated? Like I said, Wells is a staunch abolitionist. He will not brook any racism at a higher level. His officers, well ahead of any soldiers getting down there, are the first ones to see what slavery is really like. For most of the officers in the North, even though they might say they were abolitionists, or I don't care, or I'm pro-slavery, it was far away and easy to ignore. That was a problem literally in another world, and just don't rock the boat, and it's okay. Now these guys are going up the rivers and down to plantations, and they're seeing what slavery really means. And it turns a lot of them into very ardent abolitionists. Also, a number of these officers are from the Merchant Marine, where you had ethnically mixed crews, and where you learned that the hand that saved you from being washed overboard, you don't stop and ask the color of it first. You're just happy to have a shipmate help you. These guys came in, and they're only acting officers. The Navy didn't want to get top-heavy by enlisting full-fledged officers who might not leave afterwards and break up the hierarchy of promotion. So you have a lot of officers and men from the Merchant Marine and the whaling fleet who are used to working in a multi-ethnic environment. They just don't care. There's a job to do. We need everybody to do it. Like I said, there's incidental and individual racism. On an institutional level, though, the Navy is without racism. So how did this compare point by point with our soldier here? Remember how unequal his experience was. For one thing, the sailor got the same clothing allotment. You didn't pay for it. You got 2 suits of clothes every year. I think / hope 1 new set of undies. I remember reading a disconcerting story where, not willing to wait for the allotment, 2 sailors traded underwear with each other and somehow counted that as fresh. History's wonderful. You got 2 pairs of shoes, you got the same food ration. Everyone ate the same food on board the ship, for better or worse. It didn't matter what color you were. And this, by the way, was a signal event in the evolution of black sailors. When you're first allowed to eat with the whites, the Navy had always done that, so it wasn't a big deal. But sailors were allowed to basically go into the grog line. Grog over here was a whiskey-based, it was rum in the British Navy, and you got basically a shot of it every day. Now, when you do that, you queued up in a line and went to a large cauldron at the end of the line under the supervision of an officer to make sure you drank it all and got just one. To be able to be in that grog line says a lot, because everyone drank from the same cup. Think how this would evolve with white and black bubblers in 20, 30 years. You got the exact same medical care. Navy hospitals were segregated by rank. not by color. Officers got a little better treatment than sailors did, but all the sailors were treated the same. And Navy medical care was far better than Army care. For one thing, Navy doctors went through stringent training. You spent a couple years, before you became a passed surgeon. There's one story of a guy named Richard Bond who was on a gunboat and was wounded in the chest down on the river. And the closest hospital was an Army hospital. Well, they stuck him in the black ward. All but ignored him like the other black soldiers, and his health really started to plummet. The Navy came and got him, took him to the Navy hospital. He recuperated within a month and went on to live a nice long life and have far too many grandchildren. But it didn't matter what color you were. For instance, here's a shot of patients at a Navy hospital in North Carolina. 5 or 6 of those guys, I think, are African American amongst all the other white sailors. It just didn't matter to the Navy. You got the same pay. This is really interesting because pay in the Navy is something that could have been swindled or adjusted very easily. Because the Navy did not want you building up a pocket full of cash, because that would encourage you to desert. If I figure I need, X amount of money to get new clothes and a train ticket home, and I'm only so far away, I might just jump ship and never come back. So when you went on Liberty, the Navy gave you enough for a couple of drinks, and then you had to come back to the ship. They kept what you were owed on the books. Only at the end of your cruise did the paymaster say, okay, you are owed the following, go ashore, we'll pay you, have a nice life, or come back and re-enlist. It could have been very easy to cook the books for everybody, not just blacks. But the opportunity was there, and it didn't seem to matter. The same bonuses. This was, again, something that could have been cut out. You got bonuses for serving in ironclads that are painted black down in North Carolina and South Carolina heat and humidity. So while you all process that for a minute and just sweat thinking of it, black sailors got the same 25% bonus that white sailors did for serving in the South on board ironclads. Same prize money. Up until World War I, if you participated in capturing an enemy ship, and by participate, that can mean something as simple as, she's in sight of me. My ship just participated, because I'm influencing the way that ship runs or gets captured by other ships. You could pocket quite a bit of money. 2 ship's boys on board one tug, the Aeolus, participated in 2 captures in 2 days and took home $534, which at the time was 2 years worth of pay. Blacks got that the same as white sailors, and what's more, when their status was not yet solidified in 1861, they made it retroactive to all the sailors who enlisted in 61 got the same bonuses. After the war, this didn't go away. Missed one. Same treatment before the law. Black sailors actually fared marginally better than white sailors in the Navy law system. Massachusetts did a study of this, and they came out a couple points ahead of white sailors for the same crimes. What's interesting or really telling, in 1864, as an example, there was a fight between 2 sailors on board a ship, an Irishman, James Dixon, and a black fellow named James Conlon. And they get into a fist fight on the ship. And people weren't really sure why it started. They started calling each other names, questioning the legitimacy of their birth, shall we say, and they're trading punches. And the black sailor lucks in a blow on the Irish sailor, knocks him to the deck. In falling, he hits his head on an iron fitting and dies. First time I read that story, I expected the word rope was going to figure prominently in the next paragraph. It did not. The sailors were interviewed, the witnesses and the surviving sailor were interviewed, and the Navy said this was just a sailor's fight. It could have gone either way. There are no charges. Perhaps even more telling, one white sailor was executed for murdering a black sailor on board another ship. And this is another signal event. At one point, one white sailor was taken to court and charged with rape by a woman he had supposedly molested. 2 black sailors who were shipmates came to his defense and said, no, she's a prostitute, and she just wanted more than he was willing to give her at the time, money-wise, and the fact that they were allowed to testify in court in support of their white shipmate is really telling of the attitudes of the Navy. After the war, a number of states and the federal government set up a series of basically retirement homes, soldiers' homes, sailors' homes. This is what the Navy had done, by the way, with their share of the prize money. Remember the 2 boys that got $534? Well, that was chump change compared to what all the officers got and the Navy. The Navy kept half the money. And when you capture the blockade runner, the value of the boat went into Navy coffers. Amazingly, none of that seemed to go into anybody else's pocket. They invested it and set up homes for black and white sailors after the war. Pennsylvania even set up schools for black orphans of black sailors. So again, they're trying to treat everybody very, very fairly across the board. The number of blacks in the fleet starts off at that 2.5% and then slowly builds over time. Its peak is about 1864. North Atlantic Squadron, of course, that's us up here. We tap into the pool of ex-black mariners from the Merchant Marine and the whaling fleet. Mississippi, of course, it's a lot of contraband. A lot of escaped or freed slaves is why it's a third of the entire fleet down there. By 1865, it does drop down to 17% because, of course, everyone's going home. They got rid of warships faster than you can imagine. But even so, after the war, after discharges, it's still 15%, which is 6 times the number of blacks in the Navy after the war as at the beginning. So how did African Americans participate, or how were they allowed to participate in combat? On board a ship, unlike on a land engagement, there's no place to hide. I've read stories of compassionate sailors taking the youngest ship's boy and saying, "This is the safest spot on the ship, you hide here." Damned if that's not where the cannonball goes and he's the only casualty. Everyone fights, everyone can get hurt, there's no place to hide, you all got a duty, and you all need to perform it. I don't know if you can see down here in this painting, there's one single black sailor. That percentage is incredibly low since this ship is on the Mississippi, but he is there at least. The Army, although the enlisted black regiments were very hesitant about using them. Grant at the Battle of the Crater in 1864 had a specially trained black regiment with scaling ladders ready to go once they blew the crater. They knew the rebels would be disoriented. Their orders were clear. They trained for this, run through the crater, don't fire at that point, put the ladders up, storm them, and take them over. At the last minute, Grant got fearful that it would be an immense slaughter, and he'd be chastised by Northern papers saying, "Oh, you sent them in to die." So he pulls back the specialists, sends in a white regiment who were told minutes before they were going to do this, who expectedly ran into the crater, stood around, milled like a bunch of fish in a shooting gallery, and were slaughtered. He then sends the blacks in to try and help them, fearing they're specialists. They can't even get through the white regiment. So everybody has an incredibly bad day. The Navy can't do that. You can't say, you guys stay out of the way. As a matter of fact, even just shipboard life, commanders realized pretty early, you can't segregate your crew. Some on the Mississippi who were a little more racist than others decided, okay, I'm going to split the crews into 2, and we'll just have them each do different duties. It didn't work that way. Duties were done half-assed, pardon my French, or done poorly, or in much more time than it took. So you needed an integrated crew, and they knew that. Again, there's no way to keep black sailors out of harm's way, and blacks filled every single billet short of officers, although there were what are called 100 deck petty officers. You'll find a lot of black petty officers, but a lot of them are called staff petty officers. For instance, the steward's officers are staff petty officers. They have rank but no authority. If you're a deck petty officer, and there are 100 of these, you have command authority over the men in your gun crew and on the deck, and you will be listened to and obeyed. All told, 7 black sailors got the Medal of Honor in the course of the war. This one happens to be John Lawson. As far as combat goes, occasionally in the Civil War, of course, that meant capture. Unfortunately, a lot of black sailors, if captured on small river gunboats, were just executed right on the bank. This is eyewitness. They were hung or shot in the water. The Southerners didn't want them, they just wanted them killed. So whenever those ships were going to combat, and it was a majority black crew or heavy of the black crew, the Navy would stuff those boats with extra Marines, just so they had a better chance of fighting off anyone else. A lot of the sailors, when they went to places like Andersonville in this picture, sailors sort of languished in those places because the cartel that exchanged prisoners was run by the Army. And no matter how much Wells screamed about, I want my sailors back, somehow sailors were never in the mix. It was always Yankee soldiers that came back for Confederate soldiers. Stanton wanted his men. And Lincoln at one point made him, cough up a few sailors. But Wells got increasingly worried about his black sailors, how they're being treated. This was rough enough for white sailors, and he was afraid that black sailors were getting treated even more harshly than Andersonville. So again, he obeyed the letter of the law, and he quietly went to all his captains along the coast and said, cartel's a great idea. Set up your own and don't tell me about it. So local officers would basically go ashore and parley with Confederate captors and say, okay, we've got these guys, we want sailors, and you better not touch a hair of any black sailor's head. We want them back too, we're going to prioritize them. So again, Wells was willing to look the other way. So what happened after the war? Well, while the wartime situation was far from ideal, it was better than it had been. After the war, what happens is collective white memory loss. It was illustrated in this picture by Nass in 1865, asking, didn't this man contribute too? Is he not worthy as every white soldier is? The Jim Crow laws kick in, and a new word enters the vocabulary, Aryanism. We coined that word. In 2 or 3 generations, we go fight against somebody who, really believed in it across the Atlantic Ocean. But yeah, we started that term to mean white supremacy, which was a phrase they'd used for decades. The Navy also becomes more mechanical. To be fair to the Navy, when contrabands and even skilled blacks in the North had joined the fleet, they brought skills with them. You could learn carpentry and become a carpenter's mate on board a ship. You could learn sail handling. You could learn all manner of things that you would bring to the table when you went to enlist, and you could learn them pretty quickly. The Jim Crow laws forbid black Americans from learning or acquiring mechanical skills. So the Navy really didn't have too much of a training program then. It was more hands-on and bring your skills with you. Blacks weren't refused per se, but it's just like, you don't have anything we can use you for. I've got 6 other guys here who know how to run this machine. And those are the guys that got recruited. There were some black midshipmen that had been allowed to enter the Naval Academy, but towards the 1890s, they were just hounded out as racism began to rise. The number of blacks in the fleet just plummets. They're limited, by the time of World War II to basically messmates, stewards, and that. They're down to a 0.5% of the fleet. One racist rationale for this is that, of course, in the Spanish-American War, we had taken over the Philippines. And Filipinos, well, not white, weren't as black as our blacks, and they were shorter and perceived as more docile. So we'll have them as people on board a ship to do manual labor. And this is why when you start to see World War II movies come out, all of the bad B movies that came out in the early 40s, typically in a Navy crew, you'll find a whole bunch of Filipino messmates. That's actually historically accurate because we had substituted, one group for another to treat in a racist fashion. World War II changed all this, of course, just like it had in the Civil War. We needed men, and black sailors were willing to fight. This fellow on the lower right who wanted to become our first black admiral, Gravely, he actually is the first black captain of an anti-submarine ship off the Atlantic coast. And of course, the first one to go through Annapolis, Wesley Brown, graduates 4 years after the war. So how did we lose this story? We lose this story because it's a small part of the bigger Navy story. But the bigger Navy story even is a small part of the Civil War. You'll notice here the one crazy sailor back here. By the way, he outlives all these fellows. This is probably taken about 1890. It's a GAR, or Grand Army, the Republic meeting. And he wants to make very sure that the camera sees him and recognizes the Navy was there. That ratio of 1 to 26 is spot on. So what kind of history do you think comes down to us when 26 guys write their memoirs and the sailor writes his? Sailors also weren't really inclined to write stories because all these guys probably served in one of the companies from the 7th Mass, which is recruited in North Attleboro, where I'm from. So when they come home, a lot of them stay put. And as they start to get long in the tooth here, they realize, well, winning in the North or losing in the South, we took part in something significant, we should write it down. So they can compare notes, they can talk to each other. Where were you during that battle? What was Captain so-and-so doing? How did we do that? Yeah, I know we ran, but there was a reason for it. And you get these wonderful, holistic prose accounts of battles from individual perspectives. Because of the way the Navy recruited, they went to a rendezvous. This guy might be from North Attleboro, these might be his neighbors, but he went to Boston to enlist, along with sailors from all New England, New York State, Canadians, out-of-state people, and when they come home, even if you found 10 sailors here, the chances of them having served on board the same ship are virtually 0. So the sailor here can really write about maybe just what I knew, and mostly that's out in my gun port. He can't ask anyone else in his ship, what was happening on your side, or why did that happen? So you don't get too many accounts by sailors talking about their experience in ships. I went looking, just to verify this myself, were blacks represented in the post-war statuary that we put up everywhere. Now, if you're a small town in Vermont where everyone's white, and you send off all your sons and husbands and fathers, and they fought in a white regiment, there's no reason you shouldn't put up, an infantry regiment that's white. These ones, however, are 2 branches of the military. These aren't necessarily, local towns. These are the only 2 I could find, which was sort of disturbing, that showed African-American sailors. Now, in the one in Ohio, there's a black sailor there, and yes, he is rendered in the stereotypic fashion of the day, but he is part of a crew. He's in combat. They're loading that mortar to bombard probably the forts at the mouth of the Mississippi that allow Farragut to blast his way through the next day. He's represented inaccurately, but he's represented. This fellow out here is more accurately represented in New York, and you can say, if you want to be cynical, oh, he's kneeling. But the man is armed, and he's part of a crew, a boarding party. These guys are loaded for bear between cutlasses and muskets and Marines in the back. He's part of the crew. Unfortunately, it's the only 2 I could find. And so this is one example of how we lose the history. 1, we don't write about it, we don't dig for it. 2, visually, we don't realize it's there. Again, these I was surprised to find. I can find Navy monuments pretty easily, but black Navy monuments, these are the only 2. There's a good example of this, or a sad example of this, and it goes back before the Civil War, but then goes up to the modern day. And I throw this in here just because it proves my point. This is a painting made literally months after this battle when Perry won on the Battle of the Lakes. His ship, the Lawrence, is savaged, and he's transferring his flag to the Niagara to continue the battle. He's going to make it a new flagship. And we know from diary accounts in that 4 sailors ferried him over to the new ship with his flag, don't give up the ship and all that. J. Kelly or M. Baldwin painted this, and while Perry's ship was known to be 50% African American, there's probably one fellow in here. It's hard to tell because everybody gets bronzed out in the sun. His hair is a little more African American in nature than the other fellows, but it's almost impossible to tell because 2 have bandanas on. Thanks a lot. The one total inaccuracy is the little fellow up front here, which they put in just to tug at America's heartstrings. Supposedly that is Perry's nephew, Alexander. And as soon as he's in there trying to protect Perry, of course, America just gushes and, The fact that someone's trying to protect him, though, is critical. There's truth to this, but it's not that little kid. A couple years later, I forgot I made that point already, 50% is black. 2 years later, the nature of the painting starts to change. One, there's more sailors. The size of the crew is almost doubled. Alexander happily is missing. He's really at the battle, but he's not on board the ship. And guess what? The crew's all white. Amazing. In 1865, this fellow is hired to Powell to paint a mural of the battle, which of course took place technically off Ohio in the waters of the lakes, for the government building out in Ohio. And he does a reasonable job. I've highlighted here at least 3 African-American crewmen, and while that's still pretty low, it's like 25%, at least they're there, all right? The crew, except for the one fellow, is white. And there's definitely some tradition that at some point somebody did this in consternation or to hopefully protect themselves, because that posture will occur in almost every other painting. So that just stays in Ohio. In 1873, though, congressmen in Washington see the painting and like it, and commission Powell to do a new version that's still in the stairwell in the Senate. So thousands and thousands of visitors and senators walk by this every day. And a picture is worth 1,000 words, because a picture just keeps on seeping into your brain all day long. I'm someone that grew up looking at paintings like this. So my assumption, because we're missing a black sailor here, he's still there, there's a couple more black sailors, they've added a white sailor here, the mix is about the same until we get into the really racist Jim Crow era of 1911. Now suddenly we still have the fellow dodging stuff. Alexander has matured mightily. Okay, he's now a young adult or a teenager behind his uncle, and the crew again is all white. The black sailors are totally gone. Where it gets really bad is this stamp, which came out in 2013. The government came out with a stamp to commemorate the Battle of the Lakes and all that. There are some black sailors in there. We still have this fellow in. What really is galling is their explanation. You can read this on the website. They analyzed the painting, ignored the black sailor here and the fellow just off the screen, and said, we think this guy's name is Hannibal. And we think that given that we had just emancipated the race in 1865, well, I think the painter just put him in there as a sop to abolitionists. So if you read that, it just reinforces the fact that he probably wasn't really there, that we just put him in to be nice. The person who probably got this the most correct actually did it in 1943. Martial Schweig painted a series of illustrations of American history for the Works Progress Administration. And Martial did her research. This is probably a much more accurate representation of Perry's transit from one ship to another. Alexander, of course, is gone. There are the 4 trusted sailors and Old Cyrus. Old Cyrus is Cyrus Tiffany. He is neither slave nor servant. He earned his freedom, or gained his freedom, he always earned it, by being a drummer in the Revolutionary War. So he's 40 when this war starts. He lives in Taunton, Massachusetts with Perry in a separate house. He's a neighbor. They're good friends. They're best buds. He has served with Perry throughout his entire naval career. Perry actually, when the Niagara was being, the Lawrence was being ripped apart, he actually said to his friend, I want you to take this musket. I want you to make sure no shirkers weren't wounded, can get below. You'll be safe here. And of course, Cyrus was like, hell with that. I'm fighting back. And when he saw Perry get in the boat, he jumped in the boat too and protected Perry with his own body. So now you can start to see why they windowed him out. The thought that Perry only survived because a black sailor helped him, that's just beyond the pale. You do notice at least that Alexander is gone, but here's the root of that myth about someone protecting Perry. It's true, but it's not this little kid. This doesn't tug at your heartstrings if you're a white American at that time. There's also another fellow here, either Jesse Williams or Newport Hazard. We know one of those 2 were in the boat. So the scene is radically different than what's in the Senate hallways right now and seeping into everybody's brain. So it's appropriate we're in the here. I gave this talk in 2016, And the kids were interested. They paid attention, asked good questions. But at one point, I put up a poster of a black sailor. And one young fellow who probably wasn't among those paying the most attention, all of a sudden perked up and asked me a question I never thought I would hear him say. He said, "There were people like me?" And I thought that was just so bloody sad. And all I could say was, yeah, there were. And by the way, this is not hidden information. It's all out there, but we just don't go digging about it, and we don't celebrate it. This is a dark aspect of American culture. This is one bright pinpoint that we really ought to play up. If you're interested, this is not, I haven't written a book on this yet, as I have many of my other topics. The notes, however, are available. We can leave this up. The schools can leave it up. If you go to my author's website and go to talks.hdm, I sell these for cost. I just soon give them away in person, but the notes are available. There's a lot more data there also. So thank you all very much.
All you young fellows that follow the sea, to me way below the man down. Put a vent on your ears and listen to me. Give me some time to blow the man down. To me way below the man down. Give me some time to blow